Welcome back. We're going to be talking about Chapter 4 in this lecture, and I'm going to start off with criterion measurement. And really, to get started, I think it's important to define what criteria are and what their properties are. So in this segment, we'll talk just about defining properties and some of the problems with trying to define criteria. And then the next segment, we'll talk a little bit about measuring them. Okay. So defining criteria and their properties. Well, first off, there's the word criteria. What we mean in this context is evaluative standards for measuring employee success or failure. Okay, that sounds pretty objective, right? We're going to set up a bunch of criteria, maybe one or more, for evaluating employee success or failure. We need to be able to measure employee success or failure. And when we talk about measurement, we're of course talking about converting something abstract into something that is probably going to be numeric or at least consistent. So there's a lot involved in that definition. We sort of have to break it down into the different component parts. So criteria are used in appraising employee performance, training program evaluation, so looking to see whether the training program works well, selection validation, did our selection process actually result in good hires, layoff and promotion decisions. So we want to use these objective measures to help us to decide who we don't need anymore, who isn't meeting our criteria, and then maybe people who are going above and beyond and deserve promotion. Performance would be on-the-job behaviors that are relevant to the organization's goal or goals. So sometimes you'll hear the alternative terms criterion or just plain old performance, or you might hear them combined and you hear performance criterion. So in this area, we're looking at things that are relevant to the organization's goals that happen on the job, that are behaviors, right? That are observable, measurable, and are relevant to the organization's goals. So sometimes there are behaviors that are displayed at work that aren't really relevant, or they don't undermine the organization's goals. They don't further the organization's goals. So we're not really going to be interested in those behaviors. We're going to be interested in those behaviors that either support or undermine the organization's goals. All right. So we're going to get a little philosophical here for a second. The ultimate criterion. This ultimate criterion encompasses all aspects of performance that define success on the job. So we want to have this single measure, or maybe a couple of different measures, a couple of different criteria that would allow us to see, to assess all of the things that have anything to do with success, or the flip side being failure on the job. Thorndike, in his personnel selection book from 1949, pointed out that the ultimate criterion is very complex and is not accessible. This is what we call a construct. It's something that we sort of kind of know what it might be, but it's really hard to quantify and to measure. So I'll give you an analogy to something that you're a little bit more familiar with, like intelligence is complex, and it's not directly accessible. So we have to figure out ways to measure parts of it. And it's a good example to talk about intelligence and then this ultimate criterion, because a lot of times in our efforts to measure intelligence, we fall short. We measure parts of it. And that's what Thorndike says happens when we try to measure the ultimate criterion. We never completely define and measure every aspect of performance. It's just not going to happen, he says. It's too abstract. There are, by definition, things that are going to be left out. So he thinks it was folly to try and define the ultimate criterion. Instead, we should focus on the actual criterion. So these would be best real-world representations of the ultimate criterion. So things that are actually measurable, things that are actually definable. So when we're developing our actual criterion or our actual criteria, we want to make sure that we're reflecting the ultimate criterion as much as possible, while acknowledging that it's probably not going to be complete and comprehensive. So we're going to want to make sure that we include elements of the ultimate criterion that we intend to measure. So again, I'm going to give you an example from intelligence. So there are a lot of different behaviors that could be evidence of intelligence. But most intelligence tests decide to focus on certain elements that they're going to include because those are measurable for them. So it might be that we're going to give you abstract shapes, and you're supposed to predict which one would come next in a series, right? That would stand in for some aspect of intelligence, and we have figured out a way to measure it using this stand-in. So that's what we're talking about here with the actual criterion in IO psychology. We're talking about figuring out real-world representations that could be measured and could be quantified that contribute to the ultimate criterion or are part of the ultimate criterion, knowing that we probably aren't going to hit the whole ultimate criterion. So when we're talking about these actual criteria, what makes a good criterion? Well, first off, relevance. So the percent of variance in the ultimate criterion accounted for by the actual criterion. So this is this is a tricky thing because we don't even know, we've already acknowledged, thanks to Thorndike, that we probably don't know all the things that are in the ultimate criterion. And so how would we ever know for sure whether like what percent we're actually measuring with this actual criterion? So this is all sort of abstract. Those of you who have had statistics, you know that when we collect data on a sample, we're attempting to represent the population. But the truth is we don't even really know what the population looks like. So it's all sort of estimates. And so that's what we're talking about here, the percent of variance. We're talking about sort of like how much of the differences among employees is accounted for by this criterion. How much of the variance in their performance or their success is attributable to this criterion. So we call that relevance. Unfortunately, there can be contamination deficiency that can really muddy the relevance issue. So let's take a moment and talk about that. So if we imagine that the ultimate criterion is the circle on the left and the actual criterion is the circle on the right, we have a bunch of things that are part of the ultimate criterion and also part of the actual criterion that are in that overlapping part. Typing speed, typing quality, procedural adherence, all the way through to initiative. All of those are things that overlap the two types of criteria. We call that relevance, right? So we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 that are shared between the ultimate criterion and the actual criterion. And then we have some things over in the ultimate criterion that aren't being measured. Filing efficiency, written communication, oral communication, and creativity. We call that criterion deficiency. These aspects of the ultimate criterion are not being included in our measure. So the measure is deficient in that regard. If we look over on the right-hand circle, we see that there's liking and attractiveness, age, and status that are part of the actual criterion that have nothing to do with the ultimate criterion. We call this criterion contamination. Factors that have nothing to do with the ultimate criterion that might actually taint or cloud our ratings on the actual criterion. So we call that contamination. We're getting a less than ideal assessment of the employee's performance because we're being skewed by how much we like them or how attractive they are, or whether they're older, younger, middle age, and then what their status is. So those things kind of can cloud the judgment of the person making the ratings. So we call that contamination. So when we talk about relevance, we have to be aware that we're probably going to have some criterion deficiency because, like Thorndike said, we probably can't include all the different aspects of the ultimate criterion. It's probably not going to happen. It's too complex. We want to try and limit, though, the criterion contamination, where irrelevant or extraneous factors are affecting the ratings that the person is receiving on the actual criterion. All right, so relevance is one factor that makes a good criterion. Reliability is another one. This is whether the measure produces the same outcome on repeated administrations. So if I were to assess the same employee more than once, would they get the same basic kind of rating each time? Some of you may have been evaluated at work, gotten a performance evaluation, and maybe on your first performance evaluation, your supervisor gave you sort of middle of the road ratings, and you were like, I was trying really hard, I was doing the best I could at this job, and you gave me middle of the road ratings. And your supervisor might have said to you, we always do middle of the road on our first round of evaluations of a new employee, because we want to be able to leave room for you to get better, for you to grow, right? That's kind of violating this whole idea of reliability, right? If you are a really active employee who's doing the things that we want you to do, and you're actually achieving our ultimate criterion for what we want from employees, we should be able to give you the scores that reflect that on every one of your performance evaluations, right? We want to see reliability, where if you were a superstar when you came in, you're still looking like a superstar in, subsequent ratings. Sensitivity is another factor. The criteria distinguishes between effective and ineffective performers, right? We want to be able to tell the difference between employees that are achieving the organization's goals and employees who aren't. I'm comparing this to school, right? When we think about grades in classes, that's kind of this issue of, we have this criterion. We want you to show that you understand what you were taught in classes. You've integrated the material, you've learned. And when we design measures, we want them to be sensitive, so that students who have really internalized the information, really understand it really well, should get a different score than the students who didn't really study or didn't really internalize it and really didn't understand it very well. We want to be able to tell the difference between effective and ineffective performers. So we need a sensitive criterion. Practicality, another way of calling that, is usability. The criterion can and will be used by decision makers. Sometimes we develop a criterion that would be awesome if people were willing to waste the time it would take to administer this criterion. We need to be practical in developing our criteria, so that people who are going to be, doing the evaluations, or that are going to be, making decisions, actually can implement the tool, that it makes sense for them. It fits into their time schedule, it fits into their skill set, things like that. And it needs to be fair. Employees who are being evaluated need to perceive that the criteria is just, that the criteria are just. When you get an evaluation and it seems like there's been too much contamination about whether the supervisor likes you or not, it doesn't seem fair, right? I've been working really hard, and maybe we don't get along, but I've been doing my job, and I've been doing what the organization expects. I expect a fair rating of my behavior, not a fair rating of whether you like me or not. And then of course we have the issue of fairness across demographic issues, right? Like, we don't want criteria that are going to favor one sex over the other, or one race over the other, or one age group over the other. We want them to be fair evaluations, so that the criteria are representing the actual employee's performance, not something else. So, the criterion problem. Performance is the criterion in which most organizations, employees, managers, and IO psychologists are interested in. This is what we really want to try and quantify, right? How the employee is performing. And everybody's interested in that. It usually is made up of more than one criterion. Most of the time when we're trying to assess performance, there are multiple things that we want to look at, which can make it tricky, because which one's more important, which one should take precedence. That's kind of a difficult decision to make, right? Like, is it customer service, being supportive of the customers, the most important criterion, or is being efficient the most important criterion? Getting through multiple calls. Like, what criterion are we going to use as the predominant one, and which one's like sort of the backup one? Performance can be suitable for different types of decisions, right? We could use performance to help us to decide who to promote. We could be using it to decide who to fire. We could use it to decide who needs some more training. There are a lot of different decisions that are supported by performance analysis. And there's no one criterion that we could kind of design and use it for all purposes within one organization or across lots of other organizations. A lot of times you need to have specific criteria for each job within a corporation or organization. And oftentimes you need to have different criteria across different industries or organizations. So we can't just say, well, I'll just use this one that already exists. I might have to actually develop criteria for my client, whatever business they're in, to make sure that we're getting a criterion that's suitable for them. So I thought I'd share with you Campbell's taxonomy of performance. The premise in this taxonomy is that job performance is composed of multiple criteria, like I mentioned on the last slide. So performance is a sort of a mixture of job-specific task proficiency, non-job-specific task proficiency. So there's certain tasks that we need you to perform that are specific to your job. And then there are other kinds of tasks that we need you to be able to do that are probably common across a lot of jobs. So it's not just specific to this particular task. Written and oral communication tasks, demonstrating effort, facilitating peer and team performance, supervision of others, and maintaining personal discipline, and then management and administration. Pretty much every job is going to have some job-specific tasks that you need to be proficient at. They're going to have, just about every job requires a person to be able to maintain personal discipline, being at work on time, managing their time on the job, maybe juggling multiple responsibilities across the day, things like that. And then demonstrating effort. Like every job wants to see employees putting in effort. So all three of those things, I kind of highlighted them in a different color just to illustrate that like every job is going to have those three. And then we have other, the other ones that are in the darker, like if you're sort of on the bottom of the totem pole at work, you're probably not going to be judged on supervision or management and administration, right? Like those are going to be things that you're going to be assessed on if you were in a different kind of job, if you're in a managerial or a supervisory position. Written and oral communication tasks might be relevant for some jobs and maybe aren't for other jobs, right? So you can see that the ones that are in the dark green apply to some jobs. The ones that are in the lighter green or the gray or whatever color that is, those are things that pretty much all employees across all different kinds of job specifications would need to display. All right. So, multidimensional criteria and HR decisions. So, knowing that there are lots of criteria that need to be assessed, and knowing that we're going to be using the results of this to make HR decisions like hiring, firing, promoting, things like that, first thing we're going to want to do is create a composite criterion that maybe has unequal weighting. So, we're going to have multiple criteria that funnel into this one big composite criterion. And, some of them we might expect to see more of. We might say that this is really an integral part of this job. And others we might say, and also might reveal these behaviors, right? And we might hope to see them, but we don't necessarily expect to see them. So we're going to have a lot of different criteria funneling into this one composite criterion. And then once we've kind of designed the criterion, we're going to treat it like it's a single construct. So you get like an overall score across this composite criterion. So we've got the composite criterion. We've got the unequal weighting issue where the criteria dimensions contribute differentially. So the way that we decide how to weight the different criteria is going to be based on value judgments from organizational goals, like what does the organization want to see out of their employees? Or it could be based on research. Like research might tell us that it makes a lot of sense to have employees displaying these kinds of behaviors on the job because those are signs that the employee is really working hard or is really representing the company well or other kinds of things. So sometimes research will contribute the weighting scale where, we know from other similar kinds of industries that we would expect certain kinds of behaviors and that those would be beneficial to the company. So it could be the specific organization. It could be that we're applying the research to decide how to weight. If we're making decisions that have to do with an economic focus, like we want to make the most money, we want to be profitable, we want to make good decisions so that we're paying high performers well, things like that. If we have some kind of sort of financial decision making, this strategy works really well for that, so that we can sort of apply a number and end up with sort of a rating that would allow us to decide who should be paid more or less, whether we need to add another employee in this category, whether we have an employee who should be promoted or given a raise to keep them there. I mean, there are a lot of decisions that you can imagine that would be tied to this kind of multidimensional criteria approach. Dynamic criteria, these are measures that reflect performance levels which might change over time. So one of the things that is kind of changed over time is that employees don't necessarily spend their entire career at a single employer. But even if you're there just for 5 years, we might expect that over time, with experience, your performance levels might change. So we call these dynamic criteria, right? So if we realize that performance levels might change over time, we might recognize that the validity of our predictors might deteriorate over time. So it might be, maybe if we have if we're trying to use the same criteria for new hires versus incumbents who have been there for 5 years, we may get an incorrect impression of either the new hires or the 5-year veterans, right? We might get the impression that people come in working really well, and then they sort of lose motivation because we're using the same predictors and we aren't realizing that their behaviors have changed, and we need to measure the behaviors with a new scale or whatever. So I thought I'd share a couple of examples with you. One study found that NHL hockey players who had recently become captains showed a relative increase in productivity, and of course for them productivity is scoring and assists. So the idea that once you get promoted, right, in this case they became captains, you might actually change your behavior. And so what we had expected of them when they were rookies wouldn't necessarily be good measures for now that they've been promoted to captain. Another study showed that the relationship between personality variables and GPA in European medical students, the relationship sort of declined as, or increased as their time in medical school went on. So, personality didn't seem to have that much to do with their performance in their first year classes as medical students. But then as they went on in the curriculum, things like conscientiousness and factors like that predicted their success better. So we have to sort of tailor our assessments to where the employee, or in this case a medical student or whatever, might be in their progression. All right, so there are different kinds of performance criteria, and I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next segment and we'll pick up with this and finish out the chapter.